Hospital porters, pride and dignity, stop the New World Order. Welcome to Hapanwo TV. Well, this is a reply to Reactionary Expat. Now, I've done another video where I replied to him. Reactionary Expat is a YouTuber who has a YouTube channel, which is a little bit like Stefan Molyneux's. He does talks about various things to do with politics, economics, finance, sociology, things like that. So he's very, very similar in that respect to Molyneux. His channel is very interesting. I find him very interesting indeed. I often comment on it. I don't always agree with everything he says. Sometimes I do agree with things he says. Either way, I find him very interesting, and I always listen to his talks. I always do. His format is very simple. He's basically, he never shows his face, he never reveals his real name, and I don't blame him for that. And he just talks about these various things with an illustration. Now, he lives in Taiwan, in Southeast Asia, just off the coast of China. And I know his wife is Taiwanese, but he himself, I believe, is Australian. He speaks with a strong Australian accent, and I think he is basically from Australia, and he lives there, hence his name, Expat. Now, he made a video a short while ago called The Eaten. Not Eton as in Eton College, Eaten as in E-A-T-E-N. Been eaten, the past tense of to eat. And he describes what he believes is a future world. It's rather like the last one I did, because the last one I did was called Free Energy. It was based on a reply video that he did where he talks about, basically he has this rather dystopian view of the future, this rather pessimistic and rather apocalyptic vision for the future. I mean, is that a criticism? Well, only if it's unrealistic, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. If he's being realistic, then it's not a criticism to be dystopian or apocalyptic, for that matter. But he describes the possible motives for future mass depopulation by the elite. I talked a lot about depopulation in my own videos, and Expat has his own views on this, which differ from mine in the same way that his view on free energy differs from mine. But he talks an awful lot about, he's going to talk a little bit here about what might the actions be of an elite faced with a world full of environmental destruction and lots of and things like that, and lots of pollution and huge problems like that, mixed with a whole billions and billions of these little balls of flesh rolling around with nothing to do because of artificial intelligence and automation. And so he has this a vision associated with that. I'm going to talk about that. I'm also going to talk about this book as well. After I finish dealing with Expat's video, I'm going to bring up this book here too, The Four Futures by Peter Frey's Life After Capitalism by Peter Frey's, because there's a chapter in there I want to talk about, because it's very similar to, it follows a similar line to what Expat's talking about. Like, my nose always itches when I'm talking very loudly. But if you look in the link in the description box, and you'll see a link to my previous response video to Reactionary Expat, and you'll find that interesting. And the actual themes of this video are very similar, as are the themes of the video that Reactionary Expat made, which I'm replying to. So let's just begin. I start just under 2 minutes into the video. This is like about a half hour long, this video. I'm not going to play all of it. I'm just going to play certain parts of it. But this is the first bit where it becomes interesting. He just goes into several different subjects. I'll just talk about this one. So let's start.
However, I believe that for some time yet, the forces of automation and artificial intelligence on the one hand, and either outsourcing or insourcing, which we could also call immigration, will continue to gather pace such that the value of Western labour, the labour of people in developed Western nations, will approach zero for all but the cognitive elite in highly creative and governing roles.
Right. Now we already get a taste of what's to come. Okay. We have a situation of the value of labour, which is falling. And it's been falling very quickly for many years now. And there's many, many different reasons for this. He mentions immigration, of course, cheap labour from the third world. As I've said in previous videos, that is something deliberate. It's a deliberate tactic, a deliberate strategy and tactic that's been used by the elite so they can remodel Western civilization in their own image. I've talked about that on previous videos. But I mean, even if you take that away, it's still dropping. The value of labour is still dropping, and that's why wages are going down. And that is worrying for several reasons, because the value of labour is absolutely proportional to standard of living for most people, for especially working class people. That is anyone who, how do you define working class? Well, Peter Fraser has his own vision of it, which I don't agree with. But it's basically, well, anyone who has to earn a living, anyone who is dependent on labour for income, which is almost everyone. For example, there's a direct correlation, and I believe a causation too, between the presence of slave states and value of labour. I mean, I didn't know this. I only found this out a little while ago. I heard Molyneux mention it, and I thought it wasn't true. So I checked it out, and it was. The steam engine came very, very close to being invented by the ancient Greeks. And I'm not kidding. I mean, I know there's a lot of secret technology in the past. I mean, talk about the Antikythera mechanism, which was found on board a Greek ship 2,200 years ago. It's a mechanical computer. But I'm talking about in the mainstream. The Greeks had mainstream technology that came very close to inventing the steam engine. And the invention of the steam engine was one of the driving factors of the Industrial Revolution. However, the Industrial Revolution didn't happen until the beginning of the 19th century. We're talking about a situation where it could have happened over 2,000 years earlier. And the reason it wasn't developed was not because of a lack of technology, it was because it was purely economic. It was because they had slaves. They had slaves, and because they had slaves, the value of labour was so low, you didn't need. There was no economic incentive for bringing in a form of mechanisation. This is very, very important. I mean, technology doesn't just come into society as a result of being invented. It comes into society when it's been invented, and there's an economic incentive to use it. So, in other words, it's cheaper or more efficient than an existing system. So, example. You know, if you're on a Roman galley and it's cheap and you have slaves, it's cheaper just to fill the galley with 200 Ben-Hurs all going. They get one of these Greek steam engines and put it in there. If the Greeks and the Romans had abolished slavery, then there would have been incentive for mechanisation, and someone would have thought of this strange device that someone had thought of. And it would have been worked on, it would have been perfected, and it would have been developed and put into mass production, and we'd have had an industrial revolution before the birth of Christ. Incredibly, which God knows what kind of technology we'd have now, 2,000 years after that. Alternatively, I've talked about slavery in a previous video. Slavery was phased out. I mean, it technically still exists in the modern world, in India especially. But it was phased out over a period of over a century, beginning in the sort of late 18th, early 19th century. And contrary to popular belief, it was actually white heterosexuals who actually abolished slavery. Not only were white heterosexual men not completely responsible for slavery, but it was actually white heterosexual Christian men and women who were the driving force to abolishing it. Sorry, SJWs, but your worldview is a lie. So basically, if we hadn't done that, if there hadn't been an abolition of slavery 200 years ago, we would still be living today in the 21st century with medieval technology. We'd still be sowing the seeds of farms by hand, we'd be milking cows by hand, and we'd be living in an agrarian society without any technology. So you can thank the world we live in today with this computer I'm talking on now is thanks to the abolition of slavery, and then therefore this was the final thing which kick-started the Industrial Revolution. Now, this is a problem in a sense that when you have an Industrial Revolution, you have to change the format of labour. You know, the people have to change. So instead of, for example, work in a field and sowing seeds. Previously, you need about 20 people to just to put the seeds in. They'd be broadcasting the seeds, so pulling them out in bags and throwing them onto the ground. Now, when the agricultural and industrial revolution came along, things like the Jethro Tull's seed drill came along, suddenly you needed just 3 people to do the same job. So 17 people were essentially made redundant. And this is the problem we're facing now, but it's the same situation, but not exactly, because back then in the early industrial revolution there were calls to limit technology. So some of this new, for instance, a lot of people were up in arms about the seed drill. The seed drill was an invention, like I say, by this guy called Jethro Tull, sometime around 1800, which made it much easier to plant seeds. It was a machine which pushed seeds into the ground. They weren't just lying on the surface where birds would come and eat them. And there was a lot of fuss from the church about that, because they said, well, it's unholy, because in the Bible they used to do the broadcasting method. Broadcasting is where you simply get a handful of seeds and you throw it into the air and it lands on the ground. Of course, that means that most of the seeds get eaten by birds before they germinate, but because the Bible did it that way, that's how everyone would do it, and they said that was the only decent way to do it, because that's how they used to do it in the Bible. The problem with that also, I think that might have been an excuse. What they were scared of, they were scared that this form of automation would create a large, to quote Ebenezer Scrooge, a surplus population. And when you have a surplus population, what do you do with them? What are these people going to do? And already we're getting to the point that Expat is about to make, because this was an enormous fear. There was incidents where, in mills, for example, in textile mills, where machinery was smashed. There were riots and various sort of primitivist type. There was several primitivist type movements, which would actually smash up various machines, like the spinning jenny and things like that, which were new machines which were labour intensive and very efficient, and reduced the number of people you needed to operate them. And in science fiction it has a lot. I mean, Star Trek, for example, has a lot about, they have a replicator and things like that, which means that basically human labour has become redundant. However, in Star Trek, of course, there are still plenty of people around, aren't they? There are people on board the spaceships. There's Kirk and Spock and Picard and those people. Well, he's not a person, he's an alien, but you know what I mean. And the truth is, though, after the Industrial Revolution, there was no need. There was the surplus population was simply redistributed. But now we're now in a situation now where we have artificial intelligence, which means a lot of jobs which couldn't be automated in the first phase of automation 200 years ago, in this now second phase of automation 200 years later, can be. And you see it happening wherever you go. You go into a supermarket, what do you have? Self-service tills. You have automated petrol pumps. There's trains now without drivers. There's going to soon be cars without drivers, and lorries and buses without drivers too. And there's all kinds of other things. I mean, my own career of hospital portering, I mean, if you have, it's quite possible that our own role wouldn't survive this drive towards automation. I mean, it might possibly simply because the need for the human touch in the hospitals, but we would still be enormously altered. Our role would be enormously altered as a result of the use of machinery. And even when I was in my last few years at the hospital, there was talk that we were trained up with this electric bed pusher. It means that we didn't actually remove the need for the porter, but it means that we wouldn't be using muscle power to pull and push the beds. We'd have this like electric device that fitted underneath. It was like an electric driver. It's like an engine that drove the bed along, and it would fit onto the beds, and you would just drive the bed along. And you could say, well, we can always, all these people, I mean, this is the solution after the original Industrial Revolution, was simply to move these surplus agricultural labourers were moved into towns, and they were put to work in other capacities, in mills, down mines, in factories, things like that. And there's many calls now to say, well, it's okay, we simply retrain people. We retrain people to fit in with this new economy based on artificial intelligence and automation. The problem is, how many vacancies will there be for people? How many vacancies will there be? Of course, you can say, well, you know, the very very presence of artificial intelligence and automation in society means that you would need people to work on that. Robots will need building, they'll need repairing, so you need a lot of IT operatives. But how many, realistically, do you actually need? I mean, could you really retrain? Would it really be necessary for millions and millions of train drivers and bus drivers and hospital porters and shop assistants? Could they all be retrained as IT experts? Would there be enough vacancies for them? And this is a problem, and it's getting to be a bigger problem, because it's not just unskilled labour soon that will be affected. Artificial intelligence algorithms are now so sophisticated. There's some programs that also work on other things. Now, chess, for example, there's now a Blue. I think it's called Blue 2. There's now a chess. There's now a chess application which is unbeatable. It plays what they call in the chess world the perfect game every time. Every single game plays the perfect game. No human can beat it. Now, the board game Go, there was recently a match between the world Go champion and the computer. They played 3 games. The human did win one of them, but only one. And it was a best of 3 match, so the computer won 2 out of 3. But now they're talking about designing artificial intelligence programs for use in other skilled professions such as medicine, law, engineering, pilots. I mean, they're now already aircraft virtually fly themselves, and the pilot is just sitting there in case something goes wrong, basically. But it could come a time when it won't even be necessary for that. I mean, already there are drones for, say, used in the military. It's only a matter of time before pilots will be remotely controlling airliners from the ground, and the pilot will be there as a backup. And pretty soon, it could be that the AI systems on board aircraft will be so good that they'll be able to do away with the backup pilot. So, and already the Channel Tunnel railways do that as well. So, we're in a bit of a problem here. Now, there's going to be a large number of people who not only will be unemployed, but will be unemployable. They're not going to find work. They're going to, and they're going to need feeding. They're going to need clothing. They're going to need looking after. In this transitional period, as some people say it will be, between the world of labour and the world where labour is essentially obsolete, and we could end up living in some kind of post-scarcity utopia or something. There'll be this period where we'll be in neither one nor the other, and that could cause problems. And one of the solutions to that is universal basic income, and I've talked about this on the Hapanmo blog. I've written an article on universal basic income. I've changed my mind on it several times now, and now at first I thought it was a good idea, then I thought, no, it's not a good idea. I saw some flaws with it. Now I'm sort of like wondering which way I'm going to go next. But let me just play you what Expat has to say about it. So I'm going to move forward to the point. I've made some notes here. 4:15. Right, I'm just going to move forward a bit. Right.
Employers, because of their attitude towards work and so on. The likely response to all of this, in my mind, is UBI, Universal Basic Income. I've spoken about UBI before, and if I remember correctly, I haven't listened to that talk since I recorded it, but if I remember correctly, I was fairly critical of it at the time.
It was an interesting talk he did, actually. I did like it. I remember the one he did.
Now, aside from my moral objections to UBI in terms of who gets taxed to pay for whom, and also my spiritual objections, if you like, in believing that UBI will have an almost unimaginably corrosive effect upon the human soul, I want to pursue a completely different line of thinking in this talk. Frankly, I believe that UBI, if implemented, will be incredibly dangerous to people at an existential level. Now, in it,
Now, I should describe first of all what UBI is. Universal Basic Income is actually a form of social security. It's actually an alternative to the existing welfare state. What happens under the existing system is that there is a means-tested assessment process for anyone who is claiming benefits, which means you have your income looked at. Not everyone gets it. Only people who need it get it. And you have to prove you need to get it, and you have to put in an application. Now, this is a complicated and expensive process because there's a massive amount of paperwork involved. And, of course, there's the possibility and, indeed, reality of fraud. A lot of people do commit benefit fraud because they claim benefits they're not entitled to. They need to be chased up. There's a massive enforcement process and prosecution process in the courts. This affected my family, actually, because a member of my family was almost went to jail, actually, for benefit fraud. That was my daughter's aunt. She almost ended up in jail. It was in the papers. I won't tell you her name, but it was a big news story here in Oxford. Now, universal basic income is different. What happens is there's simply a flat rate which everybody gets, regardless of your employment. You just get it. Every single person gets it. This is not to be confused with universal credit, although there could be a link between the two. But I'll say a bit more about that later, because I might not be able to cover that in this film. But the good thing about UBI is that you get it regardless of your circumstances. So if you get it, the UBI, Universal Basic Income, is a money which is given to you by the state, which every single citizen gets, every adult citizen gets it. It's the same rate for everyone, and it's enough to keep you. It's not enough to give you a luxurious lifestyle, but it's enough to keep you fed, clothed, and off the streets. Right, so that's the good thing about it. And if you get a job, then you still get your UBI on top of that. So you get that and your income from your job. Your UBI payments are not affected by your employment at all, regardless of how much money you're earning. Now, I watched this guy talking about it once, where he did all the sums of it and worked out the financial cost, and he found out that it would actually be excessively expensive. And I watched someone else say, no, it would be actually. I saw it was a kind of a debate. It was kind of one of these debate programs, but they didn't talk over each other. They were just like two separate videos. And so it actually would be more efficient because it would be very, very cheap in terms of administration costs, because you wouldn't need applications and fraud and administration. These city blocks of offices used to calculate, assess every single claim and things like that. You wouldn't need to drag people into court for fraud and things like that. I suppose the problem though would be, and Expat talks about who's taxing it. I mean, where's the money come from? Well, presumably from people who are earning income on top of their UBI. And so it's it is kind of almost a rotation of payment, because you'd be paying tax towards your UBI, and your UBI would then be given back to you. I used to think that actually when I was at the hospital porter, because when I was a hospital porter for 23 years, I did what I did on the Queen's shilling. I was an employee of the state, yet I still paid tax. But the tax funded my payments. So I thought to myself, why don't they just cut out the middleman, and there's no need for this rotation of money. Just let me keep my money, not pay tax. So the concept is UBI would make everybody so rich, or everybody would be so much more well off, that they'd be able to afford the taxes to fund the system itself. Now, I don't know if that's true. I mean, UBI has there's only two places in the world that has any form of UBI. One of them is Namibia, which is in southern Africa. Another is Alaska, where there's a type of UBI based on oil profits. Alaska, USA. I don't think it's been tried out, maybe a couple of other places. The Green Party were very much in favour of it for a while, and David Icke writes about it in his Green Party book, which is called It Doesn't Have to Be Like This. And this was before he went crazy and the Green Party disowned him. Anyway, that's the basis of UBI. Now, Expat objects to it. I don't remember I remember the video he made about it, and I can't remember all the details, but I think his point was that it would remove, it would essentially make everybody essentially civic slaves, because they would become essentially financially and economically owned by the state. And that is a valid point. That is a valid worry. It makes people dependent on the state. This is one of the reasons I'm opposed to universal credit, which is actually it's similar to UBI in a way, but it just basically means that employed and unemployed people will be assessed together, and there are worrying implications for that, which I'll have to cover in a separate video or article. But I mean, maybe the less dependency we have on the state, the better, because UBI assumes that the state is benevolent and has our best interests at heart and is there to serve the people, when of course it's not. That's the problem. So I'm just going to move forward to the next bit now. So at 7:15, I'm going to move forward a couple of minutes. Okay, just another few seconds. Here we go.
By the only people left producing anything, or rather those who own the things that produce things. Essentially, I'm talking about the owners of the robots, the factories, or anything else.
Now he's now talking about the funding of the UBI system, and basically this is because UBI thing is universal basic income may be the best initial solution for a vast surplus workforce. That is, people who are basically been going to be outbred from their work by some robot. So this is for the train drivers and the shop assistants and hospital porters and people like that.
So capital, basically. So eventually, when all else has been consumed, capital will need to be taxed, either in the form of direct wealth taxes or in the form of a kind of robot income tax. I can't remember where I heard that term recently, but the sort of idea of a robot income tax, if you like, which is essentially just the same thing. Because if you're taxing the robots, well, essentially you're just taxing the owners of the robots, and you're just taking their wealth. So it all comes out the same in the wash anyway. But this is not the end of the story. This is not a story where ordinary people get to have their cake, or perhaps bread and circuses, and eat it too. It's not quite that simple. It's not quite that happy. Because I believe that if such a scenario comes to be the case, then capital will fight back against socialism. Capital will begin to recognize more and more that the system is a system of eaters, if you like. Because
eaters. Now that's a very sinister word. I should point out incidentally that I don't know exactly I can't remember what Expat's position is on this, but I do think that, this is going back to the previous bit, I do think that, contrary to what you might have heard from Norman Tebbit and these other in the old days about getting on your bike and stuff like that, very few people are actually content to be out of work. Very few people, especially men. It's undignified not to have a job. I mean, even people who complain about their jobs and maybe dislike their jobs and don't enjoy them, they will still get jobs, even when the option is not to. There are plenty of people who work when they don't need to. Men, especially. There was a porter at my hospital who had inherited a lot of money from his family. He's a very rich man. He chose to get a job as a porter and work as a porter. He was a lovely guy. Richard, his name was. He's a really sweet man, really nice guy. I went to his house once. It was enormous, but he would have, regardless of the fact that he didn't need that. He didn't need that money. He didn't need his income from portering. He chose to. He wanted to do something in which he gained an income. He gained some kind of income. It's a manly thing. It's a masculine, macho thing, if you like. But it is a part of our psychology. It's a part of our sort of almost our sexual identity as a man. And of course, it's not just men. Maybe some women will feel the same way as well. The need for that, which means, contrary to what you might have heard from various right-wing politicians, you know, people don't need some whip-cracking negative incentive to get them into work. They don't need cut their benefits to encourage them to get jobs. There is a minority of people who may be like that, but very, very few. The majority of people, as is clearly evident from the proportion of jobs available to the proportion of unemployed. It's very obvious that if you want to get people back to work, don't cut their benefits and force them into slave labour schemes like working for their job seekers allowance. Just create job vacancies for them, and they will apply for the jobs and get the jobs. I mean, this thing where you work for your unemployment benefit is an absolute abomination, and I won't say any more about that because it goes too far off topic. I'll let Expat continue.
By that point, there won't even be the real pretense of people being producers. There'll be some people doing artistic stuff or making YouTube videos and that kind of thing, but basically very few people will actually be producing anything themselves. The only caveat on this could be something like 3D printing technology, but
I should point out there is actually a novel that was written by a robot. Yeah. I haven't dared to read it yet, just in case it's better than mine. So even these kinds of professions might one day be under threat. There is I tell you what, Google the next Rembrandt, and you will find a painting. It's not a print. It's not a reproduction. It is an original painting by a robot, and it was made in the style of the painter Rembrandt, but it was actually painted in 2010 by a bloody robot. Check it out. Just Google the next Rembrandt, and it's astonishing, this work of art. So maybe Expat is being a little bit over-optimistic here, contrary to his normal demeanour.
I think they're going to try to put the brakes on that, actually. But basically, capital will realise that everyone else will be consumers. That's all they'll be. They won't be producers. They will be consumers in their entirety. That will be their sole function in society, if you like. Now,
that's true. I mean, but in a sense, that's kind of like, it's a similar situation as like now. I mean, the word eater is awful. Consumer, even worse. Consumer is used actually more. I think I dislike that word more because it's used more. It's more subtle. It's a more subtle dysphomism. It's a more subtle form of Orwellian language manipulation. Eater is just blunt. It's almost a dysphomism rather than a euphemism. A consumer is something you hear in the news. You hear it on business reports. You hear it all the time. You read it in the Financial Times. Consumer is very often used as a substitute for human being in today's world. I mean, this is not Reactionary Expat's point, but this is what you'll often find. His point here is that we will be dealing with people, like I say, who will firstly have needs, they will have desires, they'll have no means of creating that wealth for themselves. They won't be able to create capital in order to fund their needs and desires. That's the point he's making. And this brings us on to another point. I'll just move forward. But again, the phrase eaters, of course, is best known for having the word useless before it. And that was, I believe, a quote from Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger, what a mofo. Do you know he's still alive? Henry Kissinger is 94 years old, he's still walking the earth. When Keith Chegwin dies at the age of 60, and all these other good guys like Prince and Michael Jackson and David Bowie, they all die young. And these scumbags seem to last forever, don't they? Right, I'll carry on to the next bit. 35. Okay.
Why would capital give money to people to spend on its own stuff? On capital's stuff? Because if and when we manage to get to that point, then we will be admitting that money is entirely made up, which I mean I kind of believe anyway, but we will be admitting that money is entirely made up and has absolutely no meaning or value.
This is an interesting thing he's just said, because it is exactly what I said about when I was a porter, and I thought to myself occasionally, why am I paying taxes when the money which I earn from my labour comes from taxes? Why don't they just let me keep the money and not pay the tax in the first place? Or pay less tax. They can remove whatever it costs. See what I mean? And he's got a good point. You have capital, which is giving money. The capital he describes as capital. He basically means anyone who owns capital, which is a smaller and smaller number of people in this particular world. In this future scenario that he's talking about, would actually give money to people who don't own capital, so they could use that capital to buy products which is created by capital. Why doesn't capital just keep the money and give the products to the people? That's the point he's making.
That it's just numbers at that point.
It's very straight. It's a kind of rotation of capital, just in the same way that my wages when I was a porter were a rotation of the exchequer, of the exchequer funds, and it didn't make any sense to me back then, and this doesn't make any sense to Expat, and he's right.
Now, by then, the owners of capital would be able to produce their own stuff with their own robots.
Exactly, produce robotic factories, robotic shops, robotic everything. I mean, this is like in Elysium, that film Elysium. I'll be saying more about Elysium because it comes up in this book. So I'll say more about the film Elysium in a little while.
So this does beg the question of why they would need to add that superfluous step in there of having a bunch of eaters, unless they just happened to like having them hang around. But
now we're getting to the crux of it. Now we're getting to the really chilling part. Would the elite want these eaters around?
issue signalling aside, how much do the elites really like anyone else? And that's right, they don't. And I think that they will like them even less when there are 10 billion, perhaps, or 15 billion, however many, of them turning the world into a giant open-air sewer.
Now, turning into... This is another point which I'm going to have to talk about. Alright, I'll just carry on with this because it goes on to 13. But this is an important point in the sense that there's another answer to this conundrum which I've already gone into in my previous reply video to Reactionary Expat, because this comes into the issue of free energy. Because in a sense, you've got to, when you listen to Reactionary Expat in this film, you need to realise that he sees the issue of energy and resources very differently to I do, because he doesn't accept that free energy exists, and there is this free energy cover-up, which is this was the source of my disagreement with him over the last video that he did. So I'm going to continue, because he now comes up with this rather nightmarish scenario, which from a lower level of the elite, people who are not initiated into the full agenda, might actually encourage them to act in the way that Expat thinks they're going to act. And I brought this up before when it comes to say for instance the desperation of the situation over climate change, which again is on two levels. On one level, there's people in the elite who believe it. On the lower levels of the elite, the outer party, so to speak, who believe climate change is real. They believe it's a threat that's caused by humans, and therefore you need to reduce the human population or create some Agenda 21 communist utopia in order to save the planet. Whereas a higher level, the inner party, so to speak, of the Illuminati, whatever you want to call them, they know there's no such thing. This climate change stuff is all nonsense. It's just an excuse to create that very society. And those in the lower levels are being used to drive it forward unknowingly. But I'll let him say this first, because this is a really dark vision he has now.
Pardon me. Now, other than the bragging rights of having the world's largest yacht and your own secret scuba diving site off the Maldives,
Look at the size of my yacht, babies.
what is the point if you have to swim through giant garbage patches, or actually more accurately, the so-called garbage patches are actually more akin to being kind of gelatinous soups of tiny sub microscopic bits of plastic, and that every time that you see a giant turtle on your secret scuba diving trip, it has a shopping bag around its neck. I mean, what's the point of that? It's
awful when you see things like that. I know, it's pretty lousy, it's pretty awful. There's a solution to this which I'm going to come to.
The point of being the richest guy in the world, if that's the world in which you live. Likewise, what's the point in living in a city with amazing museums and opera societies and fabulous restaurants and all of the rest of it, if you can't breathe the air there, and if you either have to live behind a wall because you're terrified of what's on the other side of the wall, or if you have to spend hours traversing the favelas just to get from...
Favela is a shanty town from usually in South America. It's where there's so many poor people that can't afford their own homes, they build makeshift ones.
One outpost of high culture to the next, and en route you don't see anything taller than a dandelion growing, and the only wildlife you see happens to be roving packs of stray dogs, cats, pigeons, rats, or cockroaches. Again, what's the point of being the richest guy in the world if that's the world in which you live? And I firmly believe that there is a point somewhere in the future on this particular time horizon where the elites will ask whether they feed another billion people who do nothing at all, they're just eaters, or whether they choose to save the Bengal tiger, for instance, or another endangered species. Because...
Yeah, and that's, I see, yeah, it's... This is the part he's coming on to. Now, it does seem like that. I'm sure there are people within the outer party who think like that and are being made to think like that. And you get the situation of gated communities. I'm going to do an entire video on gated communities at some point. I've got that planned. But now regular viewers will know where I'm going to go with this, okay? Because none of this is necessary. Because we're in a situation when there is limited resources, and I'll come back to this when I bring in the book. We have a hierarchy and limited resources. So we have like an elite, which is hoarding the resources, and a mass of humanity which have none. And they're sitting there, they're living on a universal basic income which has been funded by the resources of the elite, but at the same time there's so many of them, and they're leaving rubbish everywhere, and they're killing off the wildlife and things like that. They're just, like I said, from the point of view of the elite in that situation, it's very easy that they would start to regard humans from that class, from that underclass, that massive underclass, this post-automation, post-AI underclass, as some form of pest that needs to be exterminated. But the thing about it is, if you bring a free energy into the equation, and anti-gravity, and terra preta, and all the things I talked about in my previous video replying to Reactionary Expat, which you go to the link in the description box, you'll see it. Watch that for the background I'm talking about. I'm not going to repeat all the points I made there, because it would be another hour-long video I'll be making now. But just watch that one. None of that's necessary. It is possible to have a world with no environmental destruction, no poverty, and a population of 10+ billion people, all living with all the high standards of living. When you bring free energy into the equation, you bring anti-gravity, terra preta, and all these other things into the equation, you have that scenario. It's something I've gone into before about the way that we use fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are a limited resource that costs money. They're environmentally destructive. Whether you believe in carbon emissions causing climate change or not, you cannot disagree that fossil fuels, coal, oil, is toxic to the environment. If it's not the carbon dioxide, it's other things that make it toxic. And the mining and creation is dangerous. It's dirty mining. Oil rig work is dirty and dangerous. You get oil spills and things like that, which kill seabirds and things like that. It is a toxic system, and it's been forced on us because it could have been made obsolete over a century ago, and it wasn't, because the government came across this idea that they knew this free energy existed from inventors such as Tesla, and they suppressed it. J.P. Morgan famously said, "If I can't put a meter on it, I don't want it." And they destroyed Tesla. He died a broken man. He was a sad old man living in a hotel room. And when he died, the FBI confiscated all his papers and books and prototypes and everything. They confiscated everything he had, even before the body was cold, even before the undertakers could go in and take him away. And it goes back even further than that. And it does, I mean, this will sound crazy if you're not familiar with it, but it does include the salvage of extraterrestrial spacecraft, flying saucers that crashed the Earth and are secretly salvaged. That is a part of it as well. If I think something's true, I'm not going to say otherwise. So, but there are probably some people within this elite caste that Expat talks about that are not aware of that, in which case they will see all these eating, consuming balls of flesh rolling all over the place. Because that's how they'll see us. And they'll think, we need to call in Rent-A-Kill. That's what they're going to think. They do dehumanise us, the elite. They do see us as another form of farm animal. And they'll want to treat us like they treated the cows when they got foot and mouth. Pile us all up and burn us. Now, I'll move on to the next bit now, because this is my difference with Expat is that he thinks this is a fundamental situation that we're in, whereas I believe it is an engineered situation that we're in. If it's being engineered, it's being engineered for a reason. You see, the elite do want to reduce human population, and this is the pretext they'll use to get certain elements of society behind it. The pilots of the chemtrail planes, things like that. But they are chasing an illusion. They're being told we need to do this to save the world, when they don't. They're being told to do it because simply the model for the New World Order specifies a population below 500 million people. That's less than 10% of the current world population. So, anyway, we'll go on. Expat's going to now talk about what he believes is going to happen. So, go forward a bit more. Where is it? Back a bit. Here we go.
At that point, once people move from being producers, even if only nominally, as is currently the case for many people, to a state of being consumers, wholly dependent upon others for universal basic income, they will place themselves in a highly precarious situation, either in terms of systemic shock or collapse, or in terms of being deliberately phased out. As already mentioned, most will be too dumb to see this come.
Deliberately phased out. But it's true. I mean, fertility levels are dropping everywhere. More and more women are becoming barren. More and more men are becoming sterile. Sperm counts are dropping. Miscarriage rates increasing. I've done an entire video on this. But there be many things that are the cause of this. It could be something in the food. It could be vaccines. It could be something in the chemtrails. There could be many other things. It could be electromagnetic. We don't know. But as he says, some people will be... I'll go back a little bit because he was just... I'll just let him carry on.
Out. As already mentioned, most will be too dumb to see this coming. The rest will be demoralised and outnumbered. And that's part of the plan.
Yeah, and I'm in the latter category. My last video was all about that.
To outnumber them and demoralise them. It's not clear to me that any resistance that could be organised would necessarily actually be effective by that point. Firstly, the rest of the eaters would hardly want them to end UBI in the short term. Because if there's one thing about someone who's fairly useless, who's on welfare and that kind of thing, it's that it...
Yeah, it's... Yeah, I mean, this is the big problem. If we're ever in this situation that Expat is talking about, which seems to be where we're heading, whether it's real or not, whether it's actually in a part of the real scenario of the Earth, or whether it's an engineered illusion created by the upper elite, the inner party, for the people, for these eaters, these group of people, which includes me, it amounts to the same thing. We'll be treated the same way. And so it is a precarious position we're in. And again, what can we do about it? But we will come on to that. But let me just move forward a little bit.
This will pose for them in the long term. Further to all this, since the owners of capital, who would be trying to phase people out, would not only own the entire supply chains, but also the increasingly, the increasingly automated security forces. Any resistance that did not come from...
Yeah, the automated security forces. So these are military robots, drones, things like that. I'll go back a little bit because I cut him off in mid-sentence. But yeah, these are far more sophisticated than a lot of people think. I mean, things coming out of DARPA at the moment and out of Lockheed Martin are literally science fictional. I mean, we have drones now that don't even need the pilot sitting in Arizona in front of his screen. We have drones that can actually fly. When they say fly themselves, they literally fly themselves. They have the intelligence within the aircraft itself to carry out missions. We're talking about submarines that don't need a crew, and which inherently can't be controlled from shore because they're underwater and you can't get radio signals to them, but they don't need one because they have an internal brain, an internal computerized brain. We're talking about tanks which don't have drivers that can shoot and kill simply because a machine is there to shoot and kill. The machine actually decides what to do with that, and there's no human soldier on board the tank or even back at base with a remote control to veto the artificial intelligence algorithms inside this machine. We're already seeing these things in use in several places. Several private security firms are using robots now. At the moment, it's all been done in phases. Because, for instance, you won't have it all in one go. You'll have things such as drones becoming slowly more autonomous, with the pilot in Arizona having less and less to do. It won't be done in one go. He'll still be there, but eventually the pilot will just be disposed of. They'll just do away with the pilot, and same with the land objects, same with the land ones as well. And we will literally be in a robot wars situation. But even before then, there's another point that Expat makes, which I want to go into.
Any resistance that did not come from an existing position of capital, that is, from within that class of people, would be at a significant disadvantage because they wouldn't have anything with which to fight and the supplies to keep going. Even in the case of the elite having to rely upon human security forces, it's not clear to me that said security forces would side against those who paid their salaries and wages. They would probably know a good thing when they were on it and stick to it.
It's very clear to me exactly what would happen in that situation, and what's clear to me is exactly what he's saying. The security forces, the human security forces in that situation, would obey those paying their salary. Their loyalty would be to their employer, which would be to the elite. Now I've made an entire video before, but basically what you do is you turn the military into a religion, which is what has been done. The military is a religion. It has all the trappings, it has the ceremonies, it has the sacred places, the memorials and things like that. It has the rituals you see in London with the changing of the guard, and it has the worship of the soldiers themselves as objects of deification. And that's all you need to actually get people to do it. We're dealing with men primarily. I know there's women in the forces now. It's still a male thing, and to control men, it's very easily. Men like status. You glamorise and glorify soldiers and military service to the point where it's so attractive. It's such an enticing lure for especially young guys who maybe just out of school to get involved in. And I know because it drew me in. This is what drew me to the Royal Navy. This is why when I got kicked out a few months later, I thought my life was over. I was gutted when I got kicked out. When I look back now, it may be for a good reason. So you glamorise security forces working for the elite in their gated havens and things like that will have, both internally and externally, will be lauded. They will be lauded. They will be put on such a pedestal that the idea that morality should come into anything they do will be completely and utterly irrelevant. It'll be epiphenomenal. It'll be not even considered. I mean, I'll give you a good example, right? Like a paedophile, right? A paedophile is a hated and reviled person within society. A paedophile who goes to jail has to be put in permanent solitary confinement to stop the other cons from kicking the crap out of him. Okay, that's a paedophile. When the paedophile comes out of jail, they go on a sex offenders register. People won't want to speak to them. Understandably, I mean, I'd have those feelings myself, especially if it was my child was harmed by one of these people. But a mercenary who is employed by a gangster for security purposes, even if the gangster runs a paedophile ring, has a very, very different status to the paedophile, doesn't he? He's considered someone of enormous status within the prison. He's considered to be, when he comes out of prison, he will strut around, he will boast about what he does. He says, "Oh yeah, I was head of security for Mr. Big Shop Dariato from Sicily and stuff like that." And yeah, he used to do, and they'll say, yeah, he ran paedophile rings, he had child sex slaves, and I was just security guard, man, but I was just doing my job. And that person they'll be able to brag about it. They'll get a lot of attraction from women. Again, a lot of this glorification is, as to quote Stefan Molyneux, increased sexual market value. That's all you need to. You just increase sexual market value, and that's enough to get guys in. And but to be honest, I mean, if you take away all this cultural baggage, how is the security guard who's assisting this owner of this paedophile ring, this gangster who owns a paedophile ring, any better than the actual paedophile? What makes him better? I can't think of anything. On a rational basis, I can't think of anything. The only thing that makes him better is pure emotional, illogical, cultural baggage. So what Expat is talking about here is really, I think that it's not even a question what he's talking about. It would be very, very easy to get people to work for these robber barons in their gated communities and in their fortresses, in their Elysium type thing. It would be very, very easy indeed. Until of course then the robots come along, and then all those guys will be back on the scrap heap with the rest of us. And only then will they question whether they've done the right thing. Right, so we'll go forward a little bit further now, and we're almost at the end of this bit actually. So was it 2200? I don't know.
It's going, because once the elites manage to replace any credible philosophical or physical resistance, everyone else from that point forth will be easy pickings. Thus, I think that many people are actually sleepwalking into a very dangerous place right now.
Okay, I think, and that's all I want to talk about, and I think that covers everything Expat was saying. I'm just going to come on to this book now. This is a book called The Four Futures: Life After Capitalism by Peter Fraze. Now, this is published by Verso Books last year. This year it's published, and I find it very, very interesting indeed. Now, Peter Fraze is a Marxist theoretician, so ideologically he's on a completely different. He has a completely different worldview than I do, but this does not mean I believe his insights are useless. I sometimes learn more from people I disagree with than from people I do agree with, and so I always read books by people I don't agree with, because I find it very, very engaging. The same way I like watching Expat. I don't always agree with what he says. Now, there's four basic sections of this. Now, one of them is here. You have like this is a chapter 4. It's called Exterminism, Hierarchy and Scarcity, and it mentions the film Elysium, which is a science fiction film about a nasty situation in which the Earth has gone to pot, and there's a huge amount of poverty, and people are basically living in this huge camp on Earth, whereas the elite are living on a space station where life is perfect. And he talks about this may be he believes that Elysium, the film Elysium, might be a model for what is coming, and he says here that at the end it suggests that perhaps the lifestyles of the rich can be generalised. Oh, where is it? No, but he calls it communism for the few, and he actually describes he says for the very, very rich then, the world system already resembles communism described earlier. The difference, of course, is that their post-scarcity condition is made possible not just by machines, but by the labour of the global working class. But we may come to a sense, and he talks here about the fact that the great danger posed by automation of production in context of the world of a hierarchy and scarce resources is that it makes the great mass of people superfluous from the standpoint of the ruling class. This is in contrast to capitalism, where the antagonism between capital and labour was characterised by both a clash of interests and a relationship of mutual dependence. The workers depend on the capitalists as long as they don't control the means of production themselves, while the capitalists need the workers to run their factories and shops. So it is actually a form of symbiosis. It's a conflict economics from the Marxist perspective, but it's conflict economics, but it's still it's a form of equilibrium. It's a form of the two forces are in a sense balanced. You know, Marx talks about the exploitation of the working class by the bourgeoisie. However, the bourgeoisie couldn't live without the working class there. In the same way, the working class need the bourgeoisie in a sense to give them what they get for. Now, the existence of impoverished, economically superfluous rabble pose a great danger to the ruling class, which will naturally fear imminent expropriation confronted with the threat. Several courses of action present themselves. The masses can be bought off with some degree of redistribution of resources as the rich share out their wealth in the form of a social welfare program, at least if resource constraints aren't too binding. But in addition to potentially reintroducing scarcity into the lives of the rich, this solution is liable to lead to an ever-rising tide of demands on the part of the masses, thus raising the spectre of expropriation once again. This is essentially what happened at the height of the Great Depression, blah 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 blah. Workers were empowered to demand what? Here we go. So what happens if the masses are dangerous but are no longer a working class, hence of no value to their rulers? Someone will eventually get the idea that it would be better to get rid of them. And this is exactly, in a sense, using different language, what Expat was saying. So Peter Frey's and Reactionary Expat, again, they wouldn't agree with each other any more than I agree with either of them. But it would actually, they're saying essentially the same thing. But what's sinister about this, about what Fraser's saying here, is that he's almost saying what he says at the end of this. I won't read actually the segment, but he says basically. But then after this situation has, he talks about these four futures, so they all lead to communism. Now, in the Marxist sense, communism is a society which emerges after decades of socialism. Socialism is the worker state, which would eventually wither away to create communism, which would be a stateless, it would basically be an anarchic, stateless society without classes. There'd be no class struggle. But he says that once this elite had exterminated this surplus population, it would essentially be exactly the same as if communism had been achieved by more conventional routes. That is, that the whole of society, whole of humanity, without a hierarchy and without scarcity, actually managed to achieve socialism. That's very worrying. There's something pretty sordid about that, to be honest, what this guy's just said, because like many Marxists, I mean, his morality is very, very simple. It's not good or bad, it is revolutionary or counter-revolutionary. In 1956, when the Red Army moved into Hungary, Hungary in 1956 rebelled against the Warsaw Pact. There was a coup against the communist government, against the Soviet puppet state there, and the Russians, the Soviets, sent in their forces, and they crushed the rebellion with enormous bloodshed. Up to 500,000 people, I think, were killed. And this actually caused some people within, like, say, the Western communist parties to abandon Marxism altogether. What's his name? David Aronovich writes about this in his autobiography that I've just been reading, called Party Animals. But I mean, there's people like Eric Hobsbawm, who's a famous Marxist academic here in Britain. He died a couple of years ago. Good riddance to him too. He said no, it was justified. He has a famous interview with him from 1992 where he said that the Soviet extermination of the rebellious elements in Hungary was completely justified. The slaughter of 500,000 people, brutally killed by violence and then rounded up and executed, was necessary. It was revolutionary because these people were reactionaries. They were counter-revolutionaries. So therefore, it was right to stop them because they are getting in the way of world revolution. So therefore that equals bad. And if you're a Marxist, then there's no depravity too low for you to stoop to if it aids the revolution. You know, eating a kitten for breakfast and then going into a public phone box and doing a big poo there. You know, if that aids the revolution, you go and do it. And anything good you do, any mercy you show for anybody, which is against the revolution, makes you bad. So any virtue you have, any form of compassion you have in that situation, makes you a reactionary yourself and therefore bad. I did a radio show about this a couple of weeks ago because it was the centenary of the Bolshevik Revolution. I mean, interesting, a document came to light actually after the fall of the Soviet Union, which had been written in the 1920s. And it said that it had plans for, this was before the emergence of nuclear weapons, which would make such a thing impossible. But the Soviet had plans for a military conquest of the rest of Europe. And one of the first things they would do when they conquered Western Europe was to round up all the members of Western communist parties and shoot them. Summarily execute them. Put them, all of them, against the wall, shoot them. And the reason is because they had such a naive and idealistic vision of socialism and Marxism that the moment the reality and the practicalities of Marxism faced them, they would automatically rebel and become reactionaries. So they would just shoot. So the policy was to shoot them first before they had the chance. And it's bloody awful. I mean, we were talking earlier about the power they have. I mean, once you are under their thumb, the elite, there's nothing you can. And what can you do? They don't even need to pass laws. I mean, Expat was talking about. He was talking about UBI earlier on, about who funds it. They don't even need to pass laws against things now. I mean, I've talked about this many before. For example, I mean, for instance, if you want to wreck a country's industry, and this is what has actually happened in Britain, you want to destroy a country's industry, you don't need to pass a law saying that British workers have to be put out of work, and things like that. And we have to import our coal and things like that. No, you don't. What you do is you raise corporation tax, domestic corporation tax, and you reduce import duty. Which means it's more economically sustainable to import stuff than to actually produce your own stuff. Alternatively, if you want to build up British industry, you lower corporation tax and you put massive import duties on imports. Do you see how crafty they are? You don't even need laws. You don't need force. You don't need force of law now. You just need to control. You just need to have the. You need to just have the reins of economic regulation. You can make people do whatever you want. So this leads what Expat was talking about. Again, Expat doesn't realise this is all engineered. As I said, there's no need for, even with or without automation, there's no need for anyone to be hungry. There's no need for anyone to be destitute. There's no need for environmental destruction. Using free energy, Terra Preta, anti-gravity, things like that, Tesla technology, stuff from the Roswell craft. And to adjust to a world without work, for example, there's all kinds of ways you could do it. You could cut down hours so that everybody gets to work 1 day a week or something. If people don't feel comfortable without any work at all, just say, well, just work 1 day a week. Everyone works 1 day a week. So there'll be enough vacancies for everyone for the few jobs available. There'll be enough vacancies for everybody then. There's all kinds of solutions to this. None of it is necessary. But at the same time, what does it matter whether it's necessary or not when nobody knows about it? I mean, as Expat said, there's going to be a tiny few people who know what's going on. I mean, obviously, he's one of the people who doesn't know what's going on, I think. But he sees himself as someone who knows what's going on. But even from our point of view, I'd say there are people who have the knowledge that I do, who have been educated in the same way that I have. And he says this, demoralised. He calls those people outnumbered and demoralised. And everybody else is just, they're the bread and circuses people, as he calls them. These are the people who simply have their UBI and they're spending it on leisure and stuff like that. And that's how he sees it. And the problem is, even though he's wrong about the situation, he is right about the problems faced by society, in the sense that the people's reaction to it. He's right about that. Now, of course, the solution is disclosure. I've done videos about UFO disclosure, multiple videos, all through 2015, all through last year. I've done a couple for this year of UFO disclosure 2017. I'll do some for 2018 as well. But the thing about it is, I mean, I don't know, Stephen Bassett, I mean, I'm seeing Stephen actually this weekend. He's going to be at the... I was going to go and see him where he's staying actually. I haven't had a chance to visit him. But he's staying in London. I was going to go and visit him where he's staying. But he's actually going to be at the Bases conference this weekend. I'm going to go and see him. Do get to Bases at the Black Swan actually on Saturday if you can. The Black Swan in Devizes. It's going to be a really good event. So hopefully I'll see you there. I think it's the Black Swan. Anyway, go to Miles's thing. Miles Johnston. The Bases Project website. Okay, they've got all the details there. Don't know. I'm not sure the venue is at the Black Swan. It may be somewhere else. I'm not sure. But do go to that. Do just go and check it out. But yeah, Stephen has been campaigning for this disclosure for a very, very long time, and I'm 100%. Even though I disagree with him, I'm 100% behind what he's doing, and I love the guy. I think he's really, really great that he has dedicated his life in this way to something so important. But I mean, I don't need to repeat the points I made before. But how can it realistically be done? Can willing disclosure actually take place? Not just because they have to admit that we're not alone in the universe, and there are extraterrestrial intelligences that not only are out there, but they're actually down here with us, and they have craft which have come to grief on the Earth's surface and been secretly salvaged by the government. They have to admit that. But then it goes on to once that domino's gone, all others will, because they'll say, well, okay, Roswell happened 70 years ago. And how long did it take you to back engineer it? 5 years, 10 years? And so we could have had free energy by the late 1950s. Why didn't we? And then they're going to have to admit, well, actually, Roswell wasn't the first of its kind. There were crash retrievals before Roswell, but also free energy was invented here on Earth before Roswell. And the early stuff done by Tesla and similar inventors, that goes back 50 to 60 years before Roswell, at a time when it's pretty obvious that the truth embargo was in place even then. And for those of us who know and are trying, people like Steve, and Dr. Stephen Greer, well, I don't know if I trust him, to be honest, but people like Steve Bassett, others, and me, we're trying to put a stop to this. We're trying to get this information out, because it is real. It's real. It's real. There's absolutely no doubt. I'd stake my life on it. It's real. But then most people don't know it's real. They're not hearing about it on TV. They're not hearing about it in the papers. They're not reading about it in the papers. They're not being told about it in school, and so they don't get access to this information. When they come across it on the internet, they reject it because they see these stupid TV programs that present it all as a joke. TV programs that I've been asked to take part in and I've refused. And there's people who know better. There are people like Steve who really are dedicated to this, but there are others who should know better and still behave as a bunch of morons. and I talked about this in my last video, there are people who don't have the excuse of ignorance to fall back on. There's people I can't forgive because they didn't know any better. There are people who know about UFOs, they know about exopolitics, they know about disclosure, and what are they doing? Oh, we've got to destroy Larry Warren. Nothing else matters except destroying Larry Warren. Oh, I don't know how. I can't express my contempt for these people. And if that's the situation we're in, well, what can we do? What can we do to stop this? Expat, well, the thing which Expat is talking about, even though he and I have a very different view on what's causing it, you can't argue with the effects. They are going to be exactly what Reactionary Expat is saying is going to happen. How do you stop it? How do we stop it? I mean, I don't know what to do. I really don't. I don't know what to do. I used to think I had a community, the people within the community, and there are some that I know I can trust, like Steve Bassett. There's like Miles, and like there's other people such as Richard D. Hall and Andrew Johnson that I respect, and Nick Colostrom as well, who I respect deeply, and he wants nothing to do with me. And he decided he didn't want to do any of it because some stupid little difference of opinion between us. This is a guy who knows better than anyone else what's going on in this world. And you go to Miles's conferences, and there's some people who won't go along because they don't like Miles. And you say, why don't they like Miles? And they can't really explain why they don't like him. And you look into it, and the reason they don't like him is something really trivial. Or you get the shill shaming. You get, oh, that person's a shill, they're a shill, he's a shill, she's a shill. And you ask, how do you know they're a shill? Well, they kind of look a bit shilly, and their website looks a bit like mine, and I saw them whispering on their phone and stuff like that. And there's no evidence against them to say they're a shill at all. Yet they get denounced as shills, and there's this. I don't need to repeat just look at the Shill Squad, my video. I did 2 films about the Shill. There was the Shill Squad and the Shill Squad 2 about Ben Fellows. I don't need to repeat those points again. Now, I hear from people all the time, Steve Bassett, God bless him. As much as I love him, you know, I very, very quickly got used to this. The first time I heard it, I really went along with it, but then now after a couple more times I don't react to it like I did the first time. People say, well, when's disclosure going to be? And the answer, it's a bit of a joke, but the answer is 3 months from when Steve Bassett tells you it's going to be. He's been saying it's about 3 months in the future every single time, and it's not there. And Steve never gives up. He keeps trying, he keeps going for it, he keeps pushing on about it, and he's not making a bloody penny of it. He lives in a bloody car. He sometimes gets enough for a hotel room. There's a little documentary about Steve you can actually watch. It's on YouTube, a documentary about him. Someone made a documentary, like a lady who's a film student. It's really good. But he keeps pushing, he keeps trying. And if only everyone was like him, because we need people like him. He doesn't go on about Larry Warren. He doesn't accuse people of being shills all the time. He just does it. But the problem is, I mean, I just wonder how can it happen? If it hasn't happened in the last 120 years, disclosure, which is how far we got to, at least how far we got to go back. This is before oil was even in use and coal was the principal fossil fuel. If it hasn't happened in 120 years, and it's not happened in the last few years, maybe it won't happen. Maybe it won't happen because the truth embargo is, the keepers of the truth embargo are still keeping it, despite Steve pushing and really working hard to stop them, and try and get it out, and other people doing it as well. And the truth movement is only interested in running around in circles, pointing fingers at each other, shouting, shill, fraud, I don't like you, I'm blocking you on Facebook. Oh, you know, oh my goodness me, you said that it was an attack on my character. No, it's not. It's like, That's what the truth movement is doing. That's what the exit politics community is doing. We've got to stop Larry Warren. Nothing matters except Larry Warren. He has to be destroyed. He has to be exterminated. We must get the nukes out and blow ufology to pieces, and then Larry Warren will be gone finally. So will ufology, but who cares? Larry Warren's gone. So, if disclosure hasn't happened in the last 120 years, why the hell should it happen now? Why the hell should anything we do make any difference? Goodness knows we've tried. I've been doing this now for so long. Steve's been doing it about the same length of time as I have, actually. He's been at this since, well, actually longer than me. He's been at it since the 90s, but I've been doing this now for over 10 years. Steve's been working all that time. I've had him on Hapanwo radio loads of times. I've made videos about him. I've been to see his shows. I'm going to see another show of him this weekend, and whatever happens, I will enjoy that. I'll enjoy talking to him. I'll enjoy meeting him. I'll enjoy the company and the camaraderie of the people who still exist within our community, who are good, who are kind to me, and they want the same things that I do. And they treat me well, and they treat our mission with respect. And they still have their eyes set on the goal of our mission, and not on some stupid Facebook blocking, shill shaming, infighting, little baby spat. But I mean, really, like I was saying in the last film, maybe that's all we have now. Maybe that's all we can do, is just get together, like the people on the Titanic who just went to the bar and had a drink and said, like, what's his name? Old one of the fat guys on the Titanic. He refused to get into a lifeboat. He's a rich banker, and he refused to get into a lifeboat as long as there were women and children still on the ship. He went to the bar. He just sat there drinking, and the ship went down. And maybe that's what we're doing now. Maybe. I don't know. That's an awful thought, but that's the way it is. If that's the way it is, I'm going to have to learn to live with it. Thank you for watching Hapanwo TV, and thanks to Reactionary Expat. Hospital Porters, pride and dignity. Stop the New World Order.